Well, hello, my sisters and my brothers. Hello, everybody. Are you in this struggle? Are you committed to the work? Come on, make some noise until they hear you at the White House and at the Capitol and all across this nation. Thank you so very much. I had to be here this afternoon. I landed in Atlanta at 1:30 this morning from Memphis, made my way as quickly as I could get here. Some are asking and wondering, why are we marking this of all anniversaries? There are some who are confused about this commemoration. Why mark the death? But as a Baptist preacher, I talked last Sunday about Mary Magdalene, who made her way to the tomb while it was still dark. She came while it was still dark. And like Mary Magdalene, we do not come today out of any deference to death, but out of a deep sense of devotion to the one entombed. We've come this day to say that love is not limited and it cannot be locked up, and that truth crushed to earth will rise again. Like her, we come in the dawn, and when it is dawn, it is dark. It is a dark time, and yet it is morning time. As we say in church, you'll get that a little while later. It's a dark time, and yet it is morning time. And it's our job to hang on there and hold out until the sun comes up. And so Martin Luther King Jr., in his very last speech in Memphis, said that we've got to stay in this struggle. In fact, he said we've got to give ourselves to this struggle until the very end. He said we've got to see it through. The weary prophet said, stay in the struggle. Keep your bodies in the struggle until the very end. Are you committed to the struggle? Are you committed to the work? Are you going to see it through no matter what happens in Congress, no matter what tricks they're trying to play in the White House? Is there anybody here who's committed to the struggle? So Martin Luther King Jr., 50 years ago this spring, made his way to Memphis, where he was fighting on behalf of the least of these, garbage collectors, who picked up other people's trash, and yet they were treated like trash. On February 1st, 1968, Echo Cole and Robert Walker were literally crushed in the compactor area of their garbage trucks. Their bodies were crushed because of the insanity of Jim Crow segregation that said that they could not ride in the truck with their white colleagues. They were seeking shelter from the storm of rain and wind, and yet there was no shelter from the storm of racism, and their bodies were literally crushed. And from that struggle emerged those iconic signs: I am a man. And so if anybody asks those of us who are gathered in this rally, and what a great microcosm of the kingdom of God, we are here today, red, yellow, brown, black and white, rich and poor, gay and straight. We are here because we recognize the kaleidoscopic character of the kingdom of God. And as we talk about ending racism, if you are asking today, what do we mean by white privilege? And what do we mean when we say Black Lives Matter. I submit to you that part of what it means to be an oppressed person is that you actually have to have a movement and a campaign to affirm about yourself that which others take for granted. And so they had to raise signs to say that which is obvious: I am a man. Sojourner Truth had to say over against the ugliness of racism and sexism, she had to ask rhetorically, ain't I a woman? And now, sisters and brothers standing up, fighting against police brutality, dare to say Black Lives Matter. The folk who ask, what do we mean by white privilege? And why do we have to say Black Lives Matter? I submit that you have answered your first question by asking the second question. Because part of what it means to be a person of privilege is that you do not recognize the privilege that you enjoy. And so we've come to this plaza this day to affirm the humanity of all of God's children, to say that racism must end, to say that we are standing against racism and its ability to mutate and to reinvent itself. And so there are many ways we can talk about racism today, but I never stand and speak these days without talking about mass incarceration. I submit to you as the pastor of Dr. King's Church that mass incarceration in terms of domestic policy is perhaps the central moral issue of our times. Because the tragic irony of this moment is that all of the forms of discrimination against which Dr. King fought have now reinvented themselves. Because once they name you a felon, once they convince our young people to take a plea for a mere marijuana charge, even though they may not even serve a lot of time, they end up serving a life sentence. Racism has reinvented itself because once they stigmatize you with the label of felon, job discrimination is legal, voting discrimination is legal, housing discrimination is legal. In my own state of Georgia, you cannot even get a barber's license, and so all of the doors of entry back into citizenship and human dignity have been locked. And so we stand today saying that racism must end. So we are committed to seeing this struggle. We've got to see it to the end. A few months ago, my church held an expungement event in which we convinced the entities of our county to come together, the defense attorney, the district attorney, the clerks, the judges, even the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. We said we wanted to do in one day what usually takes 120 days, and we want to waive all the fees. And so in the banquet hall of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. used to preach, we had a command center. And we asked those who had criminal arrest records, notice they had not been convicted, they just had arrest records, to meet us at the church. And I looked across the sanctuary that day, and everybody in the church that day had a record. But the truth is, that's true in church every day. Everybody in this crowd has a record, and none of us wants to be judged the rest of our life based on the dumbest thing we've ever done in life. And so in one day, we expunged the criminal arrest records of 1,000 people so that they could get jobs, so that they could apply for housing. And we began to say to our state, and we say to our nation, that you ought not lock these people up. The truth about America today is that black bodies are still imperiled. We are 50% of the prison population. The land of the free is the incarceration capital of the world. Racism has simply reinvented itself, enslaved black bodies and beaten black bodies and lynched black bodies and segregated black bodies and castrated black bodies are now handcuffed black bodies and beaten black bodies and shot while driving black bodies and shot while handcuffed black bodies and probated but never emancipated black bodies. And we say that this must end, and it must end now. Is there anybody in this crowd who's committed to seeing this struggle till the very end? As long as somebody's locked up, we're all locked up. Dr. King said, I cannot be all that I ought to be until you are all that you ought to be. We're tied in a single garment of destiny, caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. So keep on fighting the good fight, even when you're tired. Martin made his way to Memphis with all of the death threats around him. Jesus went to Jerusalem, where prophets die. They killed Martin, but they simply released his spirit. And the movement went from Memphis all over the world, and so when the walls came down in Berlin, they were singing, "We shall overcome." They crucified Jesus on the cross, but he got off the cross and got in our hearts. And some of us have been preaching good news to the poor ever since. And so you keep on fighting, you keep on struggling. Your efforts may seem small and they may seem local, but when I think about that in closing, Baptist preachers usually have 3 or 4 closings, but I only have one. When you feel like your efforts are small, I want you to remember that in the mountains of Virginia, there's a natural phenomenon called Cedar Creek. Cedar Creek is a small body of water, not much really to speak of, but it's done an amazing thing. Over the years, this tiny little creek has pressed its way through a mighty mountain. It's done the impossible. But if you were to go and ask Cedar Creek, what makes you so bad? How in the world did you manage to push your way through a mighty mountain? Cedar Creek would say, oh, don't look at me. I really get my strength from the James River. The James River is the body of water that pushes the creek. And because of the river, the creek is able to make its way through a mighty mountain. But if you were to go and talk to the James River and said, where did you get your strength? The James River would say, oh, don't look at me. If you really want to see something impressive, you ought to go and talk to the Chesapeake Bay down in Hampton, Virginia. Because, matter of fact, I have to go through the bay every 24 hours just to get recharged. Don't you know that it's really the bay that pushes the river, and the river pushes the creek, and the creek has made its way through a mighty mountain? But if you were to go and talk to the bay and say, oh, bay, what makes you so bad? The bay would say, oh, don't look at me. If you want to see something massive and impressive, you ought to go and speak to the Atlantic Ocean. And can I tell you that because I'm just a boy from Savannah, Georgia, I don't mind admitting to this sophisticated crowd that one night I had a conversation with the Atlantic Ocean. And the ocean, I said, ocean, what makes you so bad? The ocean said, what do you mean? I said, I hear that it's the ocean that pushes the bay, and the bay pushes the river, and the river pushes the creek, and the creek has made its way through a mighty mountain. The ocean said, oh, don't look at me. You ought to bow down before the pull of gravity that is causing the planets to march in single file, keeping Jupiter from crashing into Mars And behind the gravitational pull, there is a great God who is the ruler over all of this. And so keep on fighting in your local struggles from coast to coast. Keep fighting to end racism. Keep fighting to end sexism. Keep fighting to end heterosexism. Keep fighting. We will overcome. And when you're tired, know that there's a mighty ocean of God's humanity fighting behind you. Harder yet may be the fight. Right may often yield to might. Wickedness for a while may reign, and Satan's cause may seem to gain. But there is a God who rules above with a hand of mercy and a heart of love. And if we're right, God will fight our battles. And we shall overcome. We shall overcome. Let me hear you. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I still believe we shall overcome.